In our last study, we looked at the experience of King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4. And in God's mercy, we saw that God worked in the life of a pagan king, a cruel king, who had a big struggle with pride. It helped him to come to a point where he was able to fully surrender his life and fully surrender who he was to God. The last thing we know of him is that he had made a commitment to God. His transformation is a powerful reminder of the fact that no matter how great or how amazing you think that you may be, how good you think you are, God is ultimately the one who gave you what you have to get to the place where you are today. He is the reason why you are where you are today. The last thing that the king wrote in his testimony letter, it's kind of crazy. We have a king of Babylon who wrote a chapter in the Bible giving his testimony of what God did for him. And in the last verse, the last line of his letter that he wrote, says God, the last verse of Daniel 4, he is able to humble those who walk in pride. We looked at that last week. This is not a threat. God is not threatening, if you have pride, if any pride pops up, I'm going to strike you down. That's not what God is saying. It doesn't match up with the character of God throughout the rest of the Bible. This is rather a promise. If you struggle with pride, God is the only one that's actually able to help you, to learn how to be humble, to help you with that pride that you're struggling with, if you go along with the lessons that he's trying to teach you. Today we fast forward to a new king. You can turn to Daniel chapter 5. Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, who did not learn from Nebuchadnezzar's experience. He had all of the experiences that Nebuchadnezzar, and these that Nebuchadnezzar I'm sure he had passed down. And a couple of chapters that we have in Daniel is just a tiny glimpse into the experience of Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sure he had so many more experiences and stories of God working in his life. This is just a little peephole into his life. Instead of humility, Belshazzar had demonstrated, as we're going to read today, arrogance and defiance, disrespect towards the God of heaven. In the middle of a celebration, at the peak of his arrogance, Belshazzar received a message directly from God, a terrifying message of judgment, written on the wall of his palace. But as we look at Daniel 5 today, we're going to explore the dangers of pride and ignoring God's warnings, similar to what was in Daniel chapter 4. But between Daniel 4 and Daniel 5, we have one experience of two men, each of them having this experience of a struggle with pride. But one of them listened to God, and one of them rebelled and pushed away God openly away from him. Their response to God was very different, even though their struggle was practically the same, the root issue that they had. King Belshazzar was a young king. He knew all the stories of his grandfather. That wasn't something that would be ignored. Definitely, if Nebuchadnezzar realized how important it was, he would have made sure that it was passed down through the generations. He likely knew about the dream of that multi-metal statue in Daniel chapter 2 and the reality that Babylon wouldn't last forever and Nebuchadnezzar's attempt to make it last forever, the resulting story from that. I'm sure he also knew about his grandfather's banishment that we read in Daniel chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar was banished from among people. He went insane, literally crazy, for 7 years. But it resulted in his conversion and restoration to the throne of Babylon. But Belshazzar allowed his love of pleasure, his love of selfish power, to overpower anything that God might have been able. I know God was trying to speak to him, trying to communicate to him, and it overpowered any lessons that he should have learned. Nebuchadnezzar suffered a lot because of his pride. But Belshazzar didn't care. He could have cared less. He was indifferent to anything that God might have tried to teach him. Babylon came under siege by the combined armies of the Medes and the Persians. If you remember from Daniel chapter 2, what was the next kingdom after Babylon? The Medo-Persians. There was the head of gold that represented Babylon, and then the chest and arms of silver represented Medo-Persia, the Medes and the Persians. Now, this should have been a wake-up call. They probably would have had this story passed down, but when they knew who was attacking, that the Medes and the Persians combined were attacking them, that Babylon was a fortress. It had double walls that were so thick that no army could ever dream of knocking them down. It was an impregnable fortress. There was no way to knock those walls down. They had enough food. They had enough water. They had a river running right through the middle of the city. They had enough food to last them for years. Babylon could not fall. At least that's what all the people in Babylon thought. They could not be successful, this enemy. The Babylons felt incredibly safe inside and pretty much just continued life as normal. Let's go to Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. Daniel records, King Belshazzar held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine in their presence. This is pretty common for people during this era to throw massive feasts like this. There's one story that I was reading, and there's multiple accounts of different stories like this, where one of these kings somewhere back in this era, he threw a 10-day party and fed 50-something thousand people and wined and dined them and housed them, over 50,000 people for this party. It was just, they liked to do that back in that day, just kind of showing off and flexing a little bit. This was 1,000 of his nobles. They drank wine in their presence. Under the influence of the wine, Belshazzar gave orders to bring in the gold and silver vessels that his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, wives, and concubines could drink from them. So they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, wives, and concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised their gods, made of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. You got to wonder, was there any specific significance to King Belshazzar bringing these vessels to this party for some reason? It seems a little bit random. Is it possible that Belshazzar remembered that God who owned these vessels, the God that these vessels had been stolen from, had told them that this kingdom was going to be defeated by the people that are outside his walls? Is it? We don't know. But the Medes and the Persians were out there. If so, this would be an act of open defiance against God. And it doesn't matter what God said, because my city's impossible to destroy. Whatever the case, whatever the reason was, he was very intentionally defying and defiling the things of the God of heaven. Very intentionally. This party was crazy. Alcohol flowed like water. The Bible says that the king's defiant decision to drag the vessels, the cups and goblets or whatever out that belonged to the temple of God was made under the influence of wine. Under the influence of alcohol, his judgment was exceedingly poor. It led him to make really bad decisions, foolish and disrespectful choices. The Bible often warns of the dangers of drunkenness. Because it clouds your thinking, it leads to careless actions. It leads to often harmful decisions, not just that harm you, but unintentionally harm those around you. In his drunken state, Belshazzar ignored what was holy and boldly mocked God. The God that he mocked him in a way that he might not have had he been a little bit more sober. It brings out that point very clearly, that it was under the influence of wine. Suddenly, this was a time of excitement for all the people in this party. They were being very rowdy and excited. This was the vessels from God's house were here, and they were drinking from it. It was just a crazy party, and suddenly this great party hall changed from the sounds of excitement to the sounds of terror. Something had happened. The Bible says the king's face turned pale. His knees knocked together. He was so scared. He was literally shaking in his boots. All the confidence that he was trying to show was out the window. It was gone. A hand had showed up, just a hand, no arm, nothing attached to it, just a hand with some fingers on it, showed up that was writing on the plaster on the palace wall. The king couldn't read it. It was just 4 words, but he couldn't read what it was. No one in the palace could read it. he called all of the wise men, and they couldn't read it or interpret what it meant either. They had no idea what it was. He offered the third highest position in Babylon to anyone who could read or interpret this writing. Why did he offer the third highest position? Who was second in command? They refers to him as King Belshazzar, but actually he was serving as king. But his father Nabonidus was actually king during this time. He was not the main king. He was second in command. Nabonidus was somewhere else. He was either fighting a war or doing something else. The records aren't incredibly clear on where he was, but he was elsewhere. And Belshazzar was holding down the fort in the city of Babylon during this time. The Belshazzar's offer of the third highest position was actually offering the next in line to the throne. That's how desperate he was. He was desperate to find somebody that could help him, but no one could read the words. It was just 4 words that were on the wall there. Verse 9, then King Belshazzar became even more terrified when nobody could understand what it was. His face turned pale, even paler than it was apparently, and his nobles were bewildered. What do we do? This is obviously some terrifying thing. It can't be anything good. What does it mean? The queen mother hears this ruckus and comes into the banquet hall because everybody is terrified. She hears probably shrieks of terror, and it's just not the normal sounds of the party. And she comes in and the first thing she says is, "Oh, king, you don't have to be afraid." She sees him pale and shaking. Verse 11, "You don't have to be afraid. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the days of your predecessor, he was found to have insight, intelligence, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods. Your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, mediums, Chaldeans, and diviners. Your own predecessor, the king, did this because Daniel, the one the king named Belteshazzar, was found to have an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and intelligence, the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. Therefore, summon Daniel, and he will give the interpretation." I remember this man, Daniel. He's able to do a lot of good. You might remember what he did, but the reason why he was able to do what he was able to do was because he has the Spirit of God in him. Don't you think that would be amazing if somebody who realizes they need help, who don't know what to do, the first name that comes to their mind is your name? Because the Spirit of God is in you. Wouldn't that be amazing? Why don't you ask Daniel? God's with this guy. He can help you with this problem that you're having. When Daniel was brought before the king, Belshazzar spins Daniel's reputation back to his origin story of when he came into Babylon. Remember, the queen pointed to the fact that Nebuchadnezzar put him in charge of all the wise men and the magicians, all the people that he had called that couldn't help him. This guy was put in charge by your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar. But Belshazzar spins his reputation back to the beginning of when Nebuchadnezzar found him. Aren't you that guy that was a slave that King Nebuchadnezzar brought back from Judah? I've heard you have special skills, but my wise man can't do what I'm asking you to do. If you can read this writing on the wall and interpret it for me, then I'll give you position as high as I can give you. I'll give you wealth more than you can imagine. I don't really think you can do this, but I'll give you a shot. Queen Mother believed in him, but Belshazzar had pushed any notion of idea of God out of his life. Verse 17. Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts and give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription for the king and make the interpretation known to him." King, I'm not doing this for a promotion. I don't need a promotion. I am here serving my God, doing what he has asked me to do. What's in front of me right now, I'm doing what is in front of me. I don't need this promotion. I'm not doing this work to try to climb the ladder. I'm just trying to be faithful. I'll tell you the inscription, gift that God has given me. But before I do, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson. Verse 18. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave sovereignty, greatness, glory, and majesty to your predecessor Nebuchadnezzar because of the greatness he gave him. All peoples, nations, and languages were terrified and fearful of him. He killed anyone he wanted and kept alive anyone he wanted. He exalted anyone he wanted and humbled anyone he wanted. But when his heart was exalted and his spirit became arrogant, he was deposed from his royal throne. His glory was taken away from him. He was driven away from people. His mind was like the animals. He lived with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with dew from the sky until he acknowledged that the Most High God is ruler over human kingdoms and sets anyone he wants over them. King, you didn't learn from the mistakes of your grandfather. This story was not new to Belshazzar. He knew about it. It was a refresher of what he had chosen to push out of his mind because it was an inconvenient reminder of something he didn't want to think about. Continuing on, verse 22, but you, his successor, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew this. Instead, you have exalted yourself against the Lord of the heavens. The vessels from his house were brought to you, and as you and your nobles, wives, and concubines drank wine from them, you praised the gods made of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, or hear, or understand. But you have not glorified the God who holds your life breath in his hand, who controls the whole course of your life. Therefore, he sent the hand, and this writing was inscribed. Daniel's not giving an appeal. It's an announcement, a pronouncement of judgment on this king. You know, somebody doesn't get this far from what we know about God in the Bible. Somebody doesn't get this far without God working in their heart so many times before. King, you've had many opportunities to know this God. You've had the experiences that have been passed down from your grandfather. You have had experiences. You've known who Daniel is. You've known in your own experience of life, I've tried to work in your life, but you've pushed me away. You've rebelled every time when I try to help you. God can't do anything else to reach him because he's pushed him away far too many times. The writing is on the wall. King, you've gone too far. You've made the last choice that you could make to push him away. God can't do anything more for you. And Daniel doesn't have to spend very long on the inscription after this. It's pretty clear, pretty direct meaning. Verse 25. This is the writing that was inscribed, and he's reading off of the wall wherever it was on the palace. And this is the interpretation of this message. This is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means you have been weighed on the balance and have been found deficient. And Perez means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. What a pronouncement. I'm sure it's not any excitement anymore in that hall. Terror, realization that there's nothing more that can be done. You know, Mene, as you go through here, Mene, it sounds like the Aramaic word that means numbered. That's why that meant God has numbered. Tekel also sounds like the Aramaic word that means shekel, the weight of measurement that when you would measure, when you would bring in gold or whatever, you would know exactly how much a weight of a shekel or whatever would weigh. You would match that amount to see if you brought in enough shekels of gold or silver or whatever else the metal was. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom. You're done, Belshazzar. You don't have any more chances. God has worked with you so many times. You don't have any more. Tekel You've been weighed on that balance. You don't match up. You've been found deficient. You've messed up, Belshazzar. And Perez means half a shekel. That's the division. Your kingdom will be divided among the Medes and Persians. It's no longer going to be Babylon. You're done. You've destroyed the amazing legacy that your grandfather built up. You've destroyed the legacy that God worked through him to build up. Today is your day of judgment for all the years of you pushing away God, your intentional rebellion against all the things you knew. Verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. What a sad story. While this party that stopped being a party was going on, the army of the Medes and Persians was outside. They were doing what all of Babylon thought was impossible. Cyrus was the leader of the Persian army. He was leading the combined forces. Darius was the king of the Medes. And Cyrus was his nephew who was leading the army from the Persians. He was leading the army, and they, under Cyrus's guard, they redirected that river that they were relying on in Babylon for a source of water. They redirected it away from the city. They were just able to walk under the walls. They didn't have to knock it out, the walls down. They didn't have to knock through the impenetrable doors. They just walked right under the river, right in the bed of the river under the walls. Babylon had fallen. And Belshazzar had countless times to choose a different path, countless opportunities to choose differently than the one he ultimately took. He had grown up hearing stories from Nebuchadnezzar. He had grown up hearing about a king, his grandfather, who had been humbled by God because of the pride he had struggled with. He had to learn that the hard way. Nebuchadnezzar's journey shows us that God is in charge of the big picture, no matter how big or important or powerful we may think, or how much control we think we have or can have over our little sphere that we're in individually. But if we're willing, we can learn humility. We can allow him to guide us into a better path. But here's the truth. Here's the reality. God is always reaching out to you. But he will never force you to accept or to take what he is offering. He respects your choices. If you don't want what he's offering, he's not going to force it on you. He loves you too much. He will never force himself on you. He'll never force himself on anyone. In his love, God gives you the freedom to choose how you want to react to what God is offering. He lays out the whole picture in front of you. He gives you everything you need to know. But it's up to you. He leaves that up to you because he loves you. Belshazzar ignored the lessons that he could have learned from. Instead, in his pride, he chose to mock God. He chose to think that nothing could harm him or his kingdom. It didn't matter what this God said. Pride had blinded him to the reality of things. But that choice led to a judgment that he likely could have delayed or avoided had he listened to God's warnings earlier on in his life. His story is a warning for us today. God often speaks to us through his word, through the experiences of others, either in our families or those around us, through the experiences we see them go through, or through our own situations that we're going through in our own lives. These moments that we have are like gentle nudges from a loving parent, trying to guide us in the right path, trying to guide us in the right direction. It's inviting you to listen, to reflect on your own life, on the direction that you're headed, and to correct that course if you need to, if he is guiding you to, if you're veering away from God's path. God does not give you warnings because he's eager to destroy you. He's not eager to punish you. He gives you warnings because he wants to protect you. He wants to keep you safe, guide you away from danger and toward the safety, the peace, and the life that he wants to offer you. Ignoring his voice, as Belshazzar did, it can harden your hearts. It can leave you vulnerable to the natural consequences of your choices. But if you choose to listen to him, you'll find yourself being drawn closer and closer to him. You'll find yourself safe under his guidance. In 2 Chronicles 7, if you'll turn with me to 2 Chronicles, it's 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and then 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's one of those books you don't turn to very often. At least most of us don't. 2 Chronicles chapter 7. Read in verse 13. God is talking to Solomon, and Solomon had been praying about the temple and everything, and things that he was going through. He had been asking God for guidance as he was finishing up this temple. God was talking to him about the reality of what will happen when there is rebellion against God, where he's going to send judgments and things that will be on the Israelites, on his people. Verse 13, 2 Chronicles 7, verse 13. If I shut the sky so there's no rain, or if I command the grasshopper to consume the land, or if I send pestilence on my people, if it's necessary for me to send a judgment or a disciplinary measure to my people, if that is necessary. Verse 14, and my people who bear my name humble themselves, pray, and seek my face, turn from their evil ways, then I will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. Will you choose to pay attention to God's lessons that he gives you in your life? Will you walk faithfully with him? Ultimately, there's only two choices. You can choose to ignore God, go your own way, or you can choose to listen to God and follow him to safety and peace and life. Will you humble yourself? Will you pray and seek to know God? Will you turn from your evil ways, the things that you know you struggle with, the things that God has convicted you that you struggle with in your life? If you do these things, these three things, they're hard, but it's a simple list. It's hard to actually do them, but it's a simple list. Humble yourself, pray, seeking to know God. Turn from your evil ways. If you do those things, God will hear you. He won't ignore you. He's not ignoring you. He will hear you. He will forgive your sin. He will give you a life better than you could possibly imagine, both in this life and in the life to come. You may still have hard times. You will still have hard times, but with God going with you, it's a whole different battle. Ask yourself this question. This is an appeal to each person here in this room. Is God trying to teach me something? Is there a lesson that he's been nudging you to apply in your life? Those gentle nudges of a patient and loving parent. Maybe there's an area of your life that he's calling you to be a little bit more humble, where you're pushing your own pride in your life. Maybe he's urging you to let go of something that is drawing you away from him, that's pushing you away from him. He's always reaching out to you, but maybe you need to surrender something that's drawing you away from him. Don't wait until it's too late. Belshazzar waited too long. He pushed away God too many times. Don't let pride close your ears to what God is trying to tell you, what God is trying to warn you. He's calling out to you right now, this morning, gently, but urgently. He's longing to lead you into that life of purpose, of peace, and fulfillment. But you have to allow him to work in your life for that to be a reality. You know, if you find that you are struggling with something like that in your life, struggling with something that you know that God is trying to work in your life that you need to surrender to him, will you answer God's call today?